Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Unstoppable Dad Project. I appreciate you being here. Before I get into today's topic, two favors to ask you. Number one, please make sure that you're subscribed on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. We are on all the platforms, so by you subscribing, it helps feed the algorithm and continue to get those platforms to push this podcast out to more people. Number two, please make sure that you share it around with anybody who you think might get some value out of what it is that we're doing here. By you doing those two things, it will help me continue to grow this podcast, and I'll be able to continue to see the amazing growth that this podcast has had thanks to all your help. So subscribe, share it around, and help this podcast continue to grow. And for me to hopefully continue to bring you some free information and valuable information that I cover off on this podcast. Now, this week, semi-looping back to training this week, and in one of my Facebook groups that I have around training, I had a gentleman ask me a question around adding in strength training into his current regime. Currently does boxing 3 times a week, and within the question, he said to me, he said in there, wants to put on a little bit of weight, sorry, I'm just reading the question while I'm thinking about this while I'm reading this question. So, what training should I do? I do boxing 3 times a week. I want to add in some form of strength work. I would like to put on a little bit of weight if possible. What should I do with that? And with that question, those of you that have listened to the podcast for a while know what I'm going to say here. There's a lot more information we need to be able to effectively answer that question. So let's unpack the question for a little bit, because the whole point of this podcast is to, firstly, I'll give you some things that I think you need to look at to answer that particular question there. But secondly, I want to highlight a response that one particular person gave to this gentleman. And it really needs to highlight a few issues when it comes to taking advice on the internet, because the internet is a very dark and dangerous place, and there is a lot of unsolicited advice, which I guess that's what this podcast is at the end of the day. So I'm a little bit hypocritical in saying that, but I like to think that the advice and this may be delusional in me saying this, the advice that I give out comes from my experience, not only my personal experience, but also the experience from 15 years of coaching. So there is a little bit of a track record there to back it up. But first thing I want to do is I just want to cover off a couple of key points that need to be addressed within this question. So number one, we need to understand how much time this gentleman has. So right now he's doing 3 times a week. Now later on in the discussion thread, he goes on to say that his time is quite limited. He actually does the boxing by himself, so he doesn't go to a gym to do it. And the time that he actually allocates to that boxing can vary based off the needs of his kids and the needs of his family, which is a really common situation for a lot of dads, right? Like we know we need to prioritize time for ourselves and times for things that we enjoy and things that are going to keep us physically active, but that time is going to vary based off the other demands of life. So that's the first thing that we needed to know. Like, how much extra time do you have? Second thing that we want to know, which kind of got answered in that answer to the question, is like, what level of commitment do we have to this sport? Is it just a recreational deal, something you're doing for enjoyment? Is it something you're looking to compete in? And then your other life circumstances around that. Like, how committed are you to this? So for this particular guy, which a lot of the people that listen to this, a lot of the dads that I deal with, if they are doing a sport, it's from a recreational standpoint where they're doing it for the enjoyment of it. If they do compete, like it's a weekend warrior type deal, right? Where I'm just going to compete to test myself against, to see how I've progressed in my particular sport, not to go and win world championships. So that kind of answers those two questions. And the third thing that we need to look at is injury history, movement deficiencies, things like that. Like that's all, and training. And I guess when I say the last thing, there are three elements in that which all come down to your movement and your training history. So what does your training history look like? What does your training knowledge look like? Like, have you been, how intensively have you trained before in a gym? Because the movement prescription and what I will tell people to do will be vastly different based off a beginner in the gym compared to somebody who is a more advanced lifter, somebody who has maybe had 10 years of training experience, who has been taught to lift properly, who understands proper technique, loading, etc., etc., etc. The advice is going to be very different based off how long you've been training for. Now, for a lot of dads that come to me that are looking for help, they have a history of training that can be extensive. Sometimes it can be 5+ years. Sometimes it can be they've dabbled. And even then, there are varying degrees to exercise prescription and the starting point that we're going to enter this person at based off what their previous training history is. Because even though you may have had time off, what you have done your whole life leading up to that, it matters. Like, it matters when we're giving out advice. It matters in the application of your athleticism and the application, how that relates to your sport and how that relates to your body, and making sure that you're able to get something that is going to be most effective for you. So injuries, training history, what does that look like? They're the three things that we need to look at. So turns out this gentleman doesn't have a lot of extra time. He didn't have a lot of training history, so he hadn't done a lot before. So that kind of gives me a fair idea. Now, the first thing is, if you don't have a lot of extra time, are you able to make extra time to do these things? So what are the resources that you're going to have access to? If you're not able to etch out an extra 2 hours a week outside of those 3 times that you're doing, then maybe we need to reassess the goal. Maybe that, because if you... And yes, we can go back to the argument about its priorities. He can make it a priority, of course he can. But sometimes other priorities are more important than training, especially if you're already doing something. This guy's doing boxing by himself 3 times a week, which is something he enjoys. The conversation later led to it's something that he enjoys. It's good for his mental health. And this is an important piece. He has a boxing bag set up at home, so it is easy for him to go out, do 30 to 40 minutes on the bag, skipping, so on and so forth, and then get back to life. So he's quite limited for his time. So in order to add in some effective strength training, he's probably got to find at least another 2 hours a week, I would say, to be able to get to the gym. Now, if he doesn't have access to that equipment at home, he then needs to factor in travel time. So even if the gym is close, we're essentially looking at about an extra 3 hours a week that he needs to find. Now, again, we can go down the rabbit hole of him prioritizing the time and making more time for him to do that, but he may not be able to take it away from that. So back to what we need to look at, maybe we need to look at the goal, reassessing what the overall goal is. And maybe we need to look at potentially starting at adding in just some basic body weight movements, some things like squats, some lunges. We can do, especially for a beginner, a training beginner, a weight training beginner, we can do quite an effective body weight program on 30 to 40 minutes a session that he can try and add in at home an extra 2 times a week and use that as an intro. And that may be the best way for him to get into some extra strength training. And that advice is then based off his context. It is context specific, and that is a good starting point for him. Whereas if he had the time to go to the gym and he had the time to spend extra time in the gym, traveling to it to do the strength training, the advice may be different. We may look at adding in some external resistance around dumbbells, around kettlebells, things like that, if he has the time. And even as an absolute beginner, if he's a more advanced trainer, then we can start talking about potentially doing some things like barbell back squats, trap bar deadlifts, potentially some med ball plyo work, depending on his knowledge and his training history. So now that I'm kind of rattling off some of these things, you can see why answering this question, and this very broad question, even though there are specific elements of this question, we always need to get that more information. And this is where, if you're looking to add in some extra training for yourself, understanding the nuances of your particular set of circumstances is very important. Because some people will actually be able to etch out more time because the boxing is more of a priority to them, or this strength training is more of a priority to them. Some people will not, because there are going to be life circumstances that won't allow them to. And that is why it is just so important to understand context. Now, that semi-addresses the question. Again, if you want help with that, you can reach out, or something like that, and you want to get into specifics for you, you can book in a time with the link below, and we can jump on a call and I can ask more questions to get your 100% idea on your context and give you advice based off that. Now, leads me to my next point, now that we've kind of semi-addressed that. One of the responses that was given from a gentleman on the discussion thread. Now, I don't begrudge this person from doing it. Don't get angry with it, anything like that. It's one of these things that the internet is rife with, right? Unsolicited advice, and at the end of the day, that's kind of what this podcast is. So it almost feels a little bit hypocritical in me saying that. But some of the things that this gentleman threw some advice to the person. He basically said, start eating more to put on more weight, do powerlifting movements, and the two lines which kind of sparked this podcast, I guess, were adding weight to your body will only slow you down if you don't stretch, despite what other people will tell you. And that's flat out wrong. If you put more weight on, you're going to get slower. There's this little thing called physics and gravity, which if you're heavier, you are going to be slower. That's just the way that works, regardless of how much you stretch. You can lift weights and get slower. I've seen plenty of people who have it's all about the particular way that you lift weights. I did a podcast around this, and one of the lines that I love is move fast, be fast, move slow, be slow. If you do slow grinding heavy reps, there is the potential to make you slower. So there's a lot within that sentence that is wrong, especially from my experience. But the last thing is, don't let anybody tell you that any of this is incorrect, because I did it and it worked with me. Now, this is kind of, to start to wrap it all up, this is kind of the point of the podcast. And one thing I think we all need to understand whenever we're taking advice from anybody. The first thing is that there are absolutely no absolutes when it comes to training or health. Every single time will always be context specific. And someone who has coached a lot of people, or somebody who has been through the ringer, will understand that you need to completely understand the context in order to give really good targeted advice when it comes to training, when it comes to health, when it comes to nutrition, and anyone else that is generally arguing the point that there is one way to do things, either A, doesn't know what they're talking about, which is an issue when they are giving out advice, or B, if they do know what they're talking about, they're actually misleading people in order to push an agenda, which is an even bigger problem. Now, I'm going to start high horse in here a little bit because it is something that over the years I've seen lots of, and a lot of this actually pertains to things like pyramid schemes, right? Herbalife, isogenics, that type of things. I've seen a lot of people that have jumped into bed with those, and trainers, like reputable trainers who have jumped into beds with those companies, and there are a lot of things wrong with that. At the end of the day, it's a pyramid scheme. Call it network marketing. I've had every single one of them pushed to me over the last 15 years. But my thing with that has always been, firstly, there's no absolutes. Does it work for some people? I think it works for some people because it creates habit change. They actually invest in something external in order to change internally. From the point of view of product quality, there are plenty of things out there to show that the products within those particular brands are straight garbage. And from just an economics point of view, I'll explain to you why very briefly. But if you think about it, when there's more than one person getting paid, and with those pyramid schemes, it's basically like there can be 15 or 20 different levels where everybody on the way down's getting paid. And they're overly priced for a reason, because the money has to be distributed to more people. But not only are they overly priced, because the money has to be distributed to more people, the quality of product which is going to go into that is going to be less and less and less, because the actual margin that you have to spend on the product to invest in good qualities, like source good quality ingredients, is going to be so small, because it is all about making money for the people involved. It is not about the quality of the product. And again, to loop it back to what I was just saying, the people that get involved in that, if they don't know what they're doing, that is a problem. They shouldn't be prescribing things like that to people if you are unaware that there is that underlying issue with that particular product. Or the second type of person, which is where the real problem is, and as you can tell, this is somewhere that gets me a little bit fired up, is somebody who does know and they're doing it simply for profit. And that is a real problem. That is a real problem in today's day and age with these network marketing schemes, scams, whatever you want to call it, but also too with advice out there on the internet. If people are dealing in absolutes and they are telling you there is one way to do things and this is how it must be done and everything like that, that advice is generally not going to be valid for everybody. Now, can that advice, so that broad advice, be a good framework and a good starting point for some people? Yes, it can. It can be a good way for people to get started, but then understanding as you get into it, there is going to be nuance based off your particular set of circumstances and based off the outcome that you want to achieve. You need to understand that in order to, when you undertake a journey, so that you don't become discouraged with potentially a lack of results, or feeling like if you have undertaken a program or something, like you've wasted your money. But absolutes, and if somebody deals in absolutes, that is probably the first red flag or the first warning sign that maybe what they're saying may not be true. Now, when it comes to this particular gentleman who was answering this question, and his basis for the advice that he was given was that it worked for him. And there was some things that he wrote down which actually weren't too bad. Like he mentioned some medball plyo work, things like that, which is great. That's something based off, I've already mentioned in this podcast, based off the training age of the person, I may actually look to add in. But sometimes the person giving advice is an outlier as well too. And this happens all the time with some coaches, especially new coaches. They'll train one person who may get amazing results, but that person is an outlier. They're able to dedicate a whole bunch of time to training. So the more they train, the better results they're going to get. But because they have a super flexible schedule, they're able to show up to the gym 5 or 6 times a week, which means they are getting great results. That's not going to apply to the mum or dad who only has 3 hours a week to train, and very short 3 hours a week to train. I know 3 hours is 3 hours, but those of you that are parents know that sometimes it's not. So sometimes that person is an outlier. So what you need to look for is you need to look for repeated efforts. You need to look for a history of, is this person working with more than just one person? Like, if it's only just worked for them, it may not work for you. But if somebody has a repeated history of success through applying what they are doing to more than one person, and those people look in the same particular set of circumstances to you, then maybe their advice holds a little bit more validity, because they have gone through the process of applying what they've done, changing their approach based off circumstances, based off goals, and based off the outcome that they want to achieve. And they've come up with a more successful formula for a particular subset of people in a group or in a community. And they are the things that you need to look out for, because at the end of the day, just to recap on everything that I'm trying to go through here, whenever it comes to training, there will never be any absolutes. It will always be context dependent. And that doesn't matter whether it's training, that doesn't matter whether it's nutrition. Anyone that is offering you an absolute solution that thinks it will work for everybody is either lying or doesn't know what they're talking about. Sometimes the advice that some people give you is not that they are lying or they are trying to mislead you. They've done it with themselves, but sometimes they are an outlier. So what they've been able to achieve is going to be very different to you based off your individual set of circumstances. Then the biggest thing you probably need to look for, where if you are looking for help, and if you are trying to search for advice on a particular topic, what is the history of this person? Have they been in the trenches? Have they applied their theory? And do they have those repeated results to prove that what they are saying works? Because if they don't, then we need to be a little bit more critical about that advice that we're giving. And to top it all off and finish it off, advice is only useful if you apply it. If you don't apply the advice and you don't actually take action on it, there is no point in taking the advice on, because you are going to get nowhere. You are not going to know if it's going to work for you or not. So you can almost throw everything else out I've just said for the last 22 minutes, because any advice that you do take on and you decide to try and implement into your life, if you don't actually take action on the advice, of course it's not going to work, because there is no follow through in the advice that you've been given. And then, have you really given it a good go? Like, have you dedicated to doing it for a good period of time? And that's it. That's my rant. I've gone down the rabbit hole on quite a few topics there. So we've gone from training through to lifestyle. Not everything's not, you need context for any advice that you're taking. Gone on a rant on pyramid schemes and isogenics, and then finished off with a little bit of, you need to make sure that whatever it is that you do and whatever it is that you are looking to change, there needs to be some level of action that you need to take in order to move in your desired direction, or to give you a bit more of a concise roadmap on what you may need to do next. So thank you very much for listening. If you've gotten all the way through to the end, well done to you. Hopefully you got some value from it. Like, share, subscribe, and jump onto the socials and follow us there. Thanks very much. I'll see you next week. Goodbye.